Redditors who have hired a private investigator, what did you find out? When I met my wife, she seemed to have a normal modern family. 2 moms, 2 dads. Over time it became apparent her stepdad wasn't around much. Holidays, birthdays, you name it, he'd pop in to say hi, grab a nap, whatever, then take off again. My wife's family thought this was normal, just the way it had always been, since they were teenagers. He claimed to have a job following FedEx trucks around the state to prevent theft and drug trafficking. But I thought it strange and started making jokes about him having another family. Well, I guess it got my sister-in-law thinking, because she gets a favor from the pie at her law firm. Sure enough, he has not 2, but 3 wives around the state, and 5 other children between them. My sister-in-law breaks the news to her mother, who immediately changes the locks and files for divorce. They never speak again. Cold turkey. Divorce is even uncontested. As a foo, they also send the report to his other wives. Edit. I thought I was late to the thread, so I wasn't expecting as many reactions. Thanks for the gold. To answer some of the questions. Yes, polygamy is illegal, but it's not really worth prosecuting, except to make an example of people. I don't know if my Mill was his first wife or not. I do know that one of the wives had been married and divorced him between their marriage. How does it happen? Counters don't exactly share marriage certificates. His families were pretty far from each other. Was their wedding legal? No idea, Arnold. Probably the separation was just a formality for paperwork purposes, which is why it went to court, why it went uncontested, and why he never showed up again. I think he reached out once or twice, but she never answered the phone. And if he ever showed up again, we weren't told about it. My Mill is a strong independent woman of faith who just didn't know. He fooled his stepdaughters for 15 years too. My story is a little different. I had a PI investigate me. About 6 years ago I became very ill with a variety of issues that left me really quite poorly. I was an optician, and so using my hands with arthritis was just never going to be a plan. So I applied for UK disability support. I sailed through and started receiving a monthly amount. Now, fast forward a few years. I then start getting restless at home, so I retrain into a job that doesn't involve my hands. I stop receiving money, except for the benefit you can get while you work. I use it for paying a better automatic car off. Well, my very nasty mother's friend saw me start work and called the benefits office, assuming I was still claiming. Unfortunately, she exaggerated and told them I was living a normal life and even running daily. So the benefits office filmed and watched me. They thought they had an aha. Gotcha moment. Their PI provided photos of me walking unaided. When I sat in the meeting with a lot of smug fraud officers and my solicitor, I felt sick to my stomach. I really couldn't work out what the fuck was going on. They were trying to make it look like I had been running and jogging, but I knew I walked never any further than 5 meters to my car. Anyway, solicitor pointed out the photos were screenshots of a video. Asked for the videos. Videos were of me struggling to walk. One of them, I rest on my car before opening my door. Another, I was going into a supermarket and had replaced my cane with the trolley to lean on. You get the picture. So, the fraud team basically said oops, and I never heard from them again. I spend a lot of my time trying to appear normal and it bit me in the ass. And never trust these fraud TV shows now either. Edit. Holy moly, I just opened up Reddit after dinner and saw all these comments. For those asking, I no longer speak with my mother, so I'm not sure if she is still friends. The lady did it because quite honestly I think she is brainwashed into thinking anyone who claims benefits must be scummy. I'm doing well, thank you for asking. I started methotrexate last year and it seems to be holding me quite steady. Not me, but my grandfather did. He was separated from his brother when the Japanese occupied China. My grandfather safely made it to Hong Kong and eventually to Canada. His brother made it to Singapore or Malaysia according to family friends back then. So my grandfather spent a good 5 years or so working with a PI to find his brother so they can be reunited. Sadly, with just a picture and the fact many people died in the war, it wasn't much to go on. My grandfather is still alive and always thinks of his brother. It's his wish to see him one more time. Edit. Provided response in thread below and copied here. Wow, thank you everyone for the kind wishes and suggestions. To let you know, my grandfather worked with this pie many years ago, say between 1999, 2004-ish, and maybe a few touch points here and there in the years after. My grandfather was disheartened because he made many trips to Asia over the years thinking this is it. But it just cost more money and got his hopes up. No clue if the brother married, if he even made it to Singapore or Malaysia, or it can be even outside of Asia altogether. Not even sure if he's alive. He would be in his late 80s now, estimated. He has not spoken about it directly with me, just with my mom, his daughter. If I'm being honest, we haven't exactly encouraged him to continue the search either. All my aunts and uncles tell him to move on and enjoy his time in peace, rather than in constant yearning. I don't have the status in the family to overstep my mom and her siblings and start bringing up the past and asking him to consider a DNA kit. If I do, I'd have to do it in secret and consider the emotional investment my grandfather may make. He's not living unhappily by any means. He has a great life and quite accomplished with raising 6 kids to have families/homes of their own. We each take care of him. He has tons of friends, likes to cook, use WeChat to talk to anyone and everyone, travel, pre-COVID, and read. He does want to see his brother, but as time goes by the memory and drive becomes more faint and eventually the day-to-day life just makes it easier for him to accept the circumstances. I used to work for an insurance defense firm years ago. Best pie story I have is where we hired one to tail a guy who was suing our client for an injury that wasn't entirely our client's fault. The guy was refusing to settle and was insisting on going to trial, even though we offered a fair sum that would have paid his medical bills. The pie we hired got some good pics that showed the plaintiff was nowhere near as injured as he claimed, but the crown jewel of the photos was one where the guy was walking on a pier with a woman who wasn't his wife, had his hand on her ass and everything. Later in a deposition, the attorney slid the picture to the plaintiff and said something like, "Mr. Smith, obviously not his real name, who is the woman in this picture? We would like to schedule a deposition with her as well." The guy went ghost white and told his attorney he wanted to settle. At least he was smart enough to realize that if his wife found out the other woman was gonna be deposed, he was gonna have to get a family law attorney as well, because the divorce papers would soon follow. Edit. Wow, this blew up overnight. To clarify some points in the comments, no, this is not technically blackmail. Our firm had the pie follow him to see if he was faking his injuries, which is standard operating procedure, not to see if he was cheating on his wife. We had no idea he was doing that. The fact the woman in the picture was his mistress was irrelevant. The attorney would have asked for the person's contact info, even if she were just a friend, coworker, cousin, or whatever. The attorney wanted to depose her to ascertain the extent of the guy's injuries. At no point did the attorney say drop the suit or wheel out your affair to your wife. My mom's best friend. She divorced her husband and was awarded full custody of their daughter. His family was a shit show. He kidnapped his daughter and he and his parents just disappeared. This was easier in 1977 than it is now. She tried hiring a pie but couldn't afford one, so she started learning how to trace people on her own. In the days before the internet, she spent years doing this. Whenever she wasn't waitressing, she did find her daughter in 81, but by this time her daughter was poisoned. Against her mom's friend went on to get her pie license and was a pie specializing in women's issues for the next 2 decades. I don't know what happened to her after that. If she's alive, she would be in her 80s I think. Edit. Thank you for the upvotes everyone. There's a couple of common questions that people are asking about this. Did mom and daughter reconcile? I asked my mother about that. She lost contact with her friend when mom left Texas over 20 years ago. The last she knew, no, they never reconciled. They communicated. That's it. What about the police? As I explained to another comment, it was different in the 70s. Unlike now, it was easy to assume a new identity and easy to get lost. It was hard to find people who didn't want to be found. The most popular method of assuming a new identity became a plot point in the 1986 movie Highlander. Police usually considered kidnapping by a spouse to be a civil matter, to be handled by the courts. It was low priority for the police. Amber alerts weren't a thing until 1996. Before that were just milk cartons with pictures of kids on them. Edit. Amber alerts started in 1996. Before that, there were several other ways to highlight missing kids. Adam Walsh was famous. Kids appeared on television, often after the show America's Most Wanted. Not a pie, and haven't hired one, but I used to work in the office of a pie firm that specializes in insurance fraud. I would edit, and sometimes write surveillance and background investigation reports that we passed along to our clients, mostly lawyers and insurance companies. One thing that never failed to surprise me, an astounding number of people who claim to suffer devastating disabilities regularly post picture/videos of themselves running marathons and building decks in their yards. I'm comfortable saying that in at least half of the cases I handled over 2 years, our clients flagged their claimants as fraudulent because of social media. Disgruntled exes are another significant source of tips. To give an example of one of the more remarkable instances in which social media saved a case, it's summer, and on the day of surveillance, our investigator sees the claimant and his family loading their car with beach stuff. The claimant drives for a couple of hours before the investigator eventually loses sight of the vehicle. Side note, tailing someone in a vehicle without 1, arousing suspicion, or 2, losing the vehicle is hard. The investigator, being way too far from his own home to drive home, checks into a motel. The next morning, he checks his phone and finds that the claimant checked in at a water park on Facebook. Investigator makes a pit stop to buy some swim trunks and a beach towel, drives to the water park, and gets hours of covered footage of the claimant swimming in a wave pool, going down water slides, picking up and putting down his kids, and generally doing a whole lot of things you probably shouldn't be able to do with a serious spine injury. TLDR, if you're gonna commit insurance fraud, stay the hell off of social media. My good friend was only raised by her mom growing up, who would always tell her that her father had walked out on them when she was a baby, and that he had never wanted anything to do with her. My friend took it really hard and struggled through her entire childhood believing in that, but then a couple of years ago she hired a private investigator to see if they could find him again. Well, they did, and it turned out what her mother told her was a lie. Her dad is seriously one of the sweetest S&E soft-footed guys I've ever met. He left because my friend's mom forced him out when he uncovered her infidelity. I guess he wasn't actually her dad because her mom cheated on him while they were together, but he loved her like she was his own and has only avoided contacting her because her mom convinced him he legally has no rights to her child, and, even worse, she threatened to accuse him of molesting my friend when she was a baby if he reached out anyway. Thankfully my friend is an adult now and has moved out from her mom's house, and she can have the relationship with her dad that she always wanted. It just sucks that she had to go through the effort of hiring a pie to achieve that point. Edit. I talked to my friend to get a few more details, and apparently the left when she was a baby thing was a bit of an exaggeration. He left when she was about 22 months old. He only found out she wasn't his child a month prior to that. To be quite honest, I never questioned that it might be weird for them to be so connected to each other emotionally, because in his eyes she is his daughter, and her eyes, he is the dad she briefly had and then was denied access to her entire life. They have a great relationship now, and she's gone NC with her mom. Edit 2. Finding him had to do with tracking down the man whose name is on her birth certificate. That man is her dad, aka not her BO dad. I used to work for an insurance company that handled injury claims more often than not. The investigator would find nothing, or would give us a lot of video showing that the claimant was indeed injured. We would then bury the video, of course. There are, on occasion, people who are exaggerating their injuries, but they are by far the minority. The few cases where that does happen has a way of placing unfair suspicion on the legitimately injured people. My fave example was a time when the insurer sent me hours of video where they had followed this young, healthy looking, and quite physically fit fella around, leaving his house, going and working outside on a home renovation, doing lots of heavy lifting, carrying things up and down ladders. All this despite a reported back injury. The insurance adjuster was all gung-ho on taking the case to trial without making any offers. Lo and behold, I look at the video, check the age of the claimant in the file, and think to myself, this guy looks awfully young for someone in his 50s. 10 minutes of Facebook research later, I work out that the PI had been following the claimant's 25-year-old son for 2 weeks. The few cases where there is actual fraud make for good stories and get told and retold, but in reality the vast majority of claimants are on the level despite insurance company Kool-Aiders wanting to believe otherwise. I spent a lot of time having to talk them down while I did that work. My dad got my mom pregnant when she was 15. Her dad forcibly put the child up for adoption. Nobody ever talked about it, but I found out about it because my dad became an alcoholic who would black out and talk about what was bothering him. He couldn't take the losses of his oldest son, my mom who cheated on him, and the death of my little sister. My now ex-wife decided that she wanted to find my older brother, but my paternal grandfather would not cooperate. She asked my mom about it and got as many details as she could. I was against looking for him because he probably didn't know that he was adopted, and I didn't want to screw that up for him. After she got my parents' hopes up, I agreed to hire a PI. The next day we had pictures of a guy who looks like my uncle, a website to a small company that he had founded, and links to his profile for a lot of the high-profile jobs that he's had. We found out that he had been adopted by a college professor at what I would call the Harvard of the Midwest. The guy had a good life, much better than he would have had. I gathered the PI's report, pictures of his biological family, and some medical information that might be of use, and I sent him a package via certified mail. He never responded. Years later I found out that he was divorced around that same time, so I thought that maybe his ex didn't give him the information. I joined FaceSpace just to find him. He was there with pics, so I knew that it was the same guy. I sent him a PM stating who I am, why I was contacting him, and why he had been put up for adoption. I added the request that he would, at least, tell me to go to hell or something, so that I would have some kind of closure for my parents. His page went private, and I never heard from him. My mom died a few years ago. She was glad to know that he was well and successful, but never got to meet him. My dad is doing very well now, but I know that it still eats away at him. Not me, but my grandfather's first wife. Buckle in. I live in New Zealand and this happened about 15 years ago when I was a young teen. My grandfather, Jeff, his wife and my grandmother, Mary, and their 2 children, their son Patrick, my mum Ella, moved to NZ from Canada in 1986. When living in Canada they owned a large and very beautiful inn. It was often used as the place to stay/visit by famous people and dignitaries. There's even a photo of my grandparents with a baby Justin Trudeau and his father. They ran this inn for a number of years and raised their young kids whom they adopted in the early 70s. Jeff and Mary were white folk, their children were not. It was very scandalous at the time. Jeff was born in England and fought in WW2. RBAF. He moved to Canada immediately after the war and met my grandmother Mary some time after. He was 27 years her senior. Back in Canada the family split their time between the inn during summer and then lived in Fort Myers FL during the Canadian winters. This carried on for 13 or 14 years until, suddenly and seemingly one day out of the blue, he called the family into the main hall of their inn, sat everyone down, and explained that they would be selling everything and moving to Nelson, NZ. 2 weeks later, they were on a plane and on their way over. Jeff buys a couple of furniture business and a movie theater and some property. 5 or 6 years after their move, their son Patrick heads to university in Dunedin and their daughter Ella moves out, but remains in Nelson. Jeff decides he wants a divorce from Mary, and they head their separate ways. Fast forward to 2003. Jeff, Mary, and Ella have been living in Christchurch separately. Jeff has been remarried twice, and Mary has been remarried once, both since divorced. Ella now has her own child, me, and life is seemingly normal. Jeff and Mary have both independently lost any businesses or money they ever had, and would now be considered middle class. Jeff decides he'd like to rekindle his relationship with Mary as it would make financial sense. Mary agrees and they start looking for a nice new home to buy. Jeff explains that he had been declared bankrupt a number of times by this point, so he decides it's best if the house is purchased by Mary. She agrees and secures a beautiful home in a beautiful neighborhood. I move into the new house, but at this stage Jeff is still tidying up his own estate and hasn't yet moved in. He comes over one day, after I've finished school, to talk to both Mary and myself. Note, my mum Ella was working out of town, hence me moving in with them for a while. Jeff explains that a week ago, a pie called him to tell him that there was a woman in England searching for him. They confirmed that he was the right man she was looking for, and the pie explained that it was only by chance that he managed to trace him from England to Christchurch. The woman searching for him was his long-lost daughter from his first marriage during the war. So it turns out Jeff had a fling with a woman during the war. She got pregnant. They got married. He was deployed and fought. Something happened, and Jeff was assumed dead. Jeff didn't die. He moved to Canada. Same name. No real attempt to hide his identity ever. The pie found him. The lost daughter, Jen, got in touch. They spoke. He then reached out to his first wife, Karen, and bought them plane tickets to NZ. Jen and Karen stayed for a week. The Jen lived in England. The Karen lived in Alabama. Jen returned home after a week. Karen did not. Jeff pulled pin on moving in with my Mary as he had originally planned. Told her that he was going to remarry his first wife Karen. Jeff asked for Mary for her original engagement ring so that he could give it to Karen. Mary reluctantly agreed on the condition that the engagement ring would be left to me when Jeff died. He agreed and have Karen the ring, and they got married. Jeff and Karen bought an expensive house in a fancy neighborhood, and they built an even fancier second house in an even fancier neighborhood. Karen convinced him that we the family were trying to pull him away from her, and she tried to alienate us from him. 1 year later Jeff got extremely old and sick, and shortly after his diagnosis, he died. Before he died, Karen wrote us all out of the will. The second day after his death, Karen sold all of his belongings without our knowledge. The 5th day after he died, Karen got on a plane and went back to Alabama, never to be heard from again. She left with the ring, which was the only thing in the will that was left to me. We only heard from the long lost daughter Jen again about 5 years after Jeff's death, when she herself was dying. Karen wasn't even here for the funeral, and she left with all the money he had hidden in trust funds over the years, or from the sales of their properties. Karen died in 2010. She was buried with my ring. My grandma Mary, who is still alive, has never been able to get over this. My mum Ella killed herself 18 months ago. This is the story of how someone hired a pie, and it unraveled our family. Jeff was great. He was definitely into some shady shit, but he was the only male role model I had growing up. He loved me like I was the most precious thing in the world. He treated me better than he ever treated his own kids, and I miss him often. But there are so many holes and small details missing from this story that my heart aches for a chance to get the full story out of him. To this day I still wonder what the motive was for Jen and Karen trying to find him. Jen and Karen barely spoke to each other after their 1-week stay here in NZ, when Karen decided to live in NZ and remarry her first husband Jeff. What did they fight about, I wonder? Nearly everyone in this story is dead now, so I guess I'll never know, or maybe I could hire my own pie. Edit. Wow, thanks for the awards, kind redditors. Who needs a ring when I have golden hugs? Chuffed. Edit 2. Added names and words for easier reading. This is so weird. My mom and I were literally talking about this today. Not me, but my family hired a pie. So my grandpa had a younger brother. I'll call him John. That was always the black sheep of the family. Apparently my grandpa was quite protective of John and would always defend him to family and friends, saying he was a good kid who would figure his life out eventually. One day John asked my grandpa to loan him a couple $1,000s to buy a house, which was no small amount in the 60s, and after talking it over with my grandma they eventually did. John skipped town shortly after that and never contacted my grandparents again. My grandpa, being the brooding Irishman he was, never really talked about John after that. In the 80s, one of my mom's cousins was curious what happened to John and hired a pie to go looking for him. They lived in a small town in northern British Columbia, Canada, and after a while the pie found John living on the streets of Vancouver. My grandmother and my great aunt flew to Vancouver to see him because my grandpa still wanted nothing to do with it, to see if they could bring him home. My grandmother said when they met with John he was livid, absolutely faking livid, that they had found him. He was living with a small group of people that had turned into his little sort of street family. He told them he was very happy with life the way it was, to leave, and to never try to contact him again. And that was that. My grandmother and my great aunt got back on a plane and flew home without him. To our family's knowledge, lived out the rest of his days on the streets of Vancouver. I didn't hire him, 17F, but my mom did, 50F. My father is well over 20k in debt from not paying child support. He was known for living in another state and acting like I didn't exist, although my aunt, his sister whom I've never met, wants something to do with me. He was also in the military, but never took any of the money reserves. Child support world saw that and forced him to pay us. After a while, my mom grew tired of his games and hired a pie. She told him the whole story and wanted to know where he lived, where he worked, and where his family is. He found it out. Instead of my deadbeat father being thousands of miles away, he lived a few blocks away and was living with his sister, the same one that wanted to meet me after 15 years, the one that wanted me to come over to her house for lunch. Now you have to understand, my father tried to total his truck in a brick wall in attempt to kill my mother, who was still carrying me. Never ever has he or any of his family ever even met me. They all left before I was born. But finding out that same sadistic man was a few blocks away made me feel unsafe. 4 months of 500 plus later, all that was left was disappointment and uneasiness. Child support. Never got evidence of his residence or work. Pi was paid for his work and we sized the job. A very long 6-month story. I'm going to try my best to TLDR. Was scammed of over $50,000 for a business I wanted to purchase. The scammer faked tax returns, income statements, you name it, to make it all sound legit. He used fake names to hide his identity and a burner phone. I contacted my bank and told them what happened, and they told me, tough sheet. Even though it was a wire transfer and I had proof of everything. I talked to a few of my police officer friends and they said it was out of their jurisdiction and there wasn't really anything they could do. I emailed the attorney general for my state and he said he couldn't do anything because it's more than likely over state lines. So I needed to contact the US attorney general. I called the USAG assistant and she told me I needed to talk to the FBI, but I would more than likely not get my money back. I called the FBI and they said I needed to file on like3.gov. But I would more than likely not hear anything about this. I post online on a business group on Facebook and found an additional 7 people that were also scammed from the same person. One of them had audio recordings of their phone calls. Total was over $300,000. I hire an attorney to help me out and back me up legally. He said I needed to hire a PI to find this person. I post online on a business group on Facebook and found an additional 7 people that were also scammed from the same person. One of them had audio recordings of their phone calls. Total scammed from just us 8 was over $300,000. The PI starts doing their thing. Within 48 hours they are able to find who he is and provide me with phone numbers, addresses, business names, you name it. I give all the information to my attorney and share it with the other 7 people. I look up the guy's name online and he went to prison 20 years ago for doing the same scam. Himself and 11 other individuals are in a Mayfair and scammed $6 million in 2 years. And the ringleader committed 6 counts of arson. My attorney got in contact with the scammer's attorney, and as of last week, I'm receiving all my money back and so are the other 7 individuals. I'm truly disappointed at the fact not one US government agency seemed to give a shit about any of this. TLDR. Private investigators are awesome and will find you the right person. I found the description of a car that my sister was kidnapped in. Years ago my sister, 15 years old at the time, was kidnapped from our home in the northeast. She left a note saying she was leaving for a better life, but we didn't buy it. The note made her a runaway, so an Amber Alert announcement to everyone's cell phones of a missing minor couldn't be activated since it wasn't technically a kidnapping. We hired a private investigator that my uncle knew. The PI uncovered a string of deleted emails within 24 hours after her disappearance with the description of the car she's be picked up in from a guy we suspected could be her kidnapper. Let's call him Stan. To help paint a picture, Stan was 27 at the time of this incident. Point should be the end right there, but it wasn't. Stan was at his home in Florida. The police went to his house and there he was just sitting there low-key. Turns out Stan had hired someone to come get my sister from my home and bring her to Florida for him, all under the promise to her that they'd live an amazing life together. Stan told this man that my family abused her and it wasn't safe for her there, all lies to squash any doubt this hired guy might have. The driver eventually spotted and was tailed by 2 undercover vehicles. They waited until he pulled over for gas to approach the vehicle, not knowing if he was armed or willing to put up a fight. I got my sister back, and after years of therapy she's a functioning member of society with a totally cool significant other. I testified against Stan in federal court, and he was locked up 10 years ago and still resides in a federal prison in Florida. Turns out he had coaxed my sister into trusting him for close to 2 years through an online game. That means it all started when she was just 13 and he was 25. What a disgusting trash can of a human. TLDR, my sister went missing and a pie found a description of the car she was taken in, leading to her recovery. Edited for clarity into TLDR. My husband and mother-in-law hired a pie to find out who her biological parents were. She always knew she was adopted when she was 6 months old and that her biological mother was a single woman that couldn't take care of her, but that's all they ever told her. The pie found her mother and found out that she was the product of an affair. Her biological father was a wealthy businessman in the small town she grew up in, and her mother was his secretary. He was married, and it couldn't get out that his secretary was pregnant because she was unmarried, and people in town would talk. So he sent her to a home for unwed mothers to have the baby and put her up for adoption. This was in 1942 in a small town in Arkansas, and unmarried women getting pregnant would have been big news. So she called up her biological mother and told her who she was, and her mother she was hesitant to meet her, but eventually agreed to it. Turned out she has 2 brothers and a sister, and several nieces and nephews, and they kept in touch for a few months. Then they cut ties when they found out what giant pieces of shit my mother-in-law and brother-in-law are. So yeah, my husband doesn't get to know his aunts, uncles, and cousins because of his narcissistic mom and brother. Money well spent, I guess. I briefly worked for a pie when I was much younger, like 19. Getting the job was a funny story itself. I was walking past the office, which is in a tiny strip mall smack in the middle of a residential neighborhood. On a whim, I decided to go in and see what a real pie's office looked like. Pretty unremarkable, except for the huge biker sitting at the only desk in a polo shirt and slacks. We got to chatting, and I asked if he was hiring. He laughed and asked me what kind of work I was expecting. I told him probably lot of boring work sifting through papers in the library and courthouse. He laughed again. He did that a lot. We called him Santa because of that and his white beard, and gave me the job. I worked there for 3 months, during which we did a lot of insurance work. That consisted mostly of sitting in a car, reading a book, occasionally taking pictures of some guy in a neck brace or leg cast walking to or from his car, and 2 or 3 times taking pictures of a guy playing baseball or basketball in his backyard. But Santa also had a much reduced rate for tracking down biological parents/siblings/children. We had one case where this woman in her 30s wanted to find her bio mom. We went on our usual course, visiting courthouses, city halls and libraries, to track this woman down. We spent a whole month on it. We also worked other cases during that time, which was a bit longer than usual, as the woman didn't know her mother's name, only her adopted parents, who had passed years ago. The woman didn't have any of the adoption paperwork either, and didn't know where it would be filled. This was in the 90s, when not everything was digital. I finally found the adoption paperwork in a courthouse in the next county over, and got a name. I was running late. Santa didn't let me work overtime, so I made to drop off the copies of the paperwork at his office and go, but the guy stopped me before I could leave. He was all excited by the mother's name. It's his wife. His wife who'd given up a baby for adoption 30-something years ago. He called his wife, who dug up her copies of the adoption paperwork from back when, and sure enough, it's a match. We called the client, who didn't answer, then went and picked up his wife and drove to the client's home. She's on the phone with her adopted sister. Talking about our effort. The pie and his wife immediately bear hugged the women, who was very confused. Both were too emotional to get the words out, so I explained that the woman was her BO mom and the pie her husband. Faking beautiful scene. Man, that memory is one of the things that's kept me from turning bitter over the years. It was enough to put off my then imminent loss of faith in God for another decade or so, that this woman had hired her BO mom's husband to find her BO mom. My mom and I got into a big fight one day. She was verbally, emotionally, and physically abusive and manipulative. On this particular day, she told me to get the fuck out of my home. I was so overwhelmed, but didn't even hesitate. I left my house in my old DAF car while it was storming super hard. She then came outside in the rain with just a long shirt on and slammed her hands on the hood of my car begging me not to leave. She's bipolar and has manic depressive disorder anyways. I backed out the driveway and went to my shitty boyfriend at the time's house. She didn't know where he lived, but figured I was with him. She called my phone literally hundreds of times begging me to come home and threatening suicide by out of her prescriptions. This was all just an attempt to manipulate me, and she didn't even attempt anything. I stayed the night at my ex's house and went to school the next day. My mom called a private investigator to find me. Apparently this guy sucked at his job. Somehow he didn't manage to think of attempting to call my school because my mom didn't think I would be at school. He also didn't see me walking to and from school to where my ex lived. It was literally across the street from my school. I don't know, never saw anyone or know much more than that. I went back home after 2 days since the woman my ex lived with told me to leave since she had 3 kids. 2 friends of the kids, 5 dogs, and probably 10 cats living there. She was a hoarder, and the house was infested with roaches absolutely everywhere, including inside the fridge and everywhere food was kept. It was so disgusting. So leaving was both good and bad, I guess anyway. Don't try to get the cheapest pie available. Kind of funny one. Dad was working 100+ weeks for a better part of 3 years building his business, and the time at home he'd spent time being a dad. One week when my brother and I got home from school, we went on business as usual and play PlayStation and watch cartoons until about 8 p.m. to do our homework in front of mom so she'd think we weren't sheetheads. Well, mom didn't come home and we assumed they were busy working, so we just went to bed. Didn't see anyone home in the morning, which wasn't unusual, so we got ready for school like normal. This continued for 3 days, and when our sister came home from uni she asked where are our parents, and we shrugged our shoulders and said haven't seen them in forever, and she panicked, asked around the neighborhood, and didn't get any info. This is where it gets hazy, since it was recounted to me, but apparently, she went to the police station. Yes, she left my brother and I alone at home, and after getting no info she was referred to a pie. The pie went around and checked as usual spots for delinquent parents, casino, strip clubs, motels, bars, and didn't see their cars or anyone who looked like them. The next day he went to check dad's company and asked around. He found out that our parents went on vacation to Acapulco. The guy visited us at home, relayed this info, and said the most rational thing anyone had ever said: they had to have left something to let you know, right? Turns out they did. They left it in the mailbox because they figured we'd check the mail daily, and left us contact info, money, a checkbook, and emergency contacts just in case. Looking back, it makes sense. Since it was December, we were almost out of school, sister was on winter break, it was mom's birthday a few days before they left. We were just a bit too dense to check the mailbox, since it is something you check daily. For reference, this was in the early 2000s, so we didn't have cell phones, because our parents thought we wouldn't need one. After that they realized we weren't the brightest kids, and needed them just in case we were ever in need of help. My dad is kind, but gullible. I knew this when I was 16, but didn't have the means/funds to investigate at that age. Someone he knew at work was having multiple large expenses thrown his way in a short amount of time. Deaths in the immediate family, surgery for his daughter, vet bills for his wife's sick dogs that she didn't want to put down. They were supposedly very old and more in pain than joy at this point, and he had gotten into a costly car accident. All of the events happened within a month or so, and he asked my dad for some money every week or so, knowing full well that my dad wasn't doing so well himself. We too went through a period of time where I didn't expect dinner on the table every night and the power would randomly cut out for the rest of the month. A week or so after my dad had given him around $10k in total, he didn't come into work anymore, didn't answer his phone, and was never heard of again by anyone locally. When I was in college, this man still bugged me. My dad had always pressured me to let it go, but I sure something was up. I hired a PI to look into him, and it turns out that he was found dead a few years after he disappeared on the other side of the country. He never had a wife and kids. His immediate family had passed on way before then, and was never involved in a car accident until he was in a recently bought used Civic that had been run off the road. Apparently he was a drug addict and owed tens of thousands of dollars to loan sharks. Edit. For clarification, he wasn't giving away money when he couldn't pay the bills. I'm just adding flavor text that explains why I think my dad would help this dude. My dad isn't a piece of shit. He's my hero. I'd appreciate it if you all stop drawing the wrong conclusion. My aunt broke ties completely with our family about 28 years ago. Why? I have no idea, but I think she's pretty insane and had taken her husband and 2 boys, my cousins, with her. I tried off and on for probably 11 years to track down one of my cousins, to no avail. Finally, I hired a PI to help me, and within a month, the guy had tracked him down. Turns out, my cousin, had something of a split with his immediate family. They're still in contact, but it's a very strained relationship, and the PI discovered he had legally changed his name, which is why I was having so much difficulty finding him. Once I had his new name, I was able to find him and his wife on Facebook, and I cold messaged them. It must have sounded completely bizarre to them both, but I had enough family information to convince them that 1, I was totally legit, and 2, there was more family out there. Apparently my aunt had never even told him that most of us existed, and it's a pretty sizable extended family. Even better, my cousin and his wife are lovely people, and they happened to live maybe 25 minutes from where my spouse and I were getting ready to move back to within the ensuing 8 months. They're awesome, a little counterculture, which is where I think the split with his immediate family originated, but really just super nice and low-key hilarious to be around. Saturday after Thanksgiving last year, we had a bunch of the extended relatives over to our house so that they could meet him and he could meet them. Best $1,500 I ever spent. Oh, finally one I can answer. I didn't hire a PI. I was one for about 4 years. I'm still licensed interstates actually. I have a ton of stories, but I can give a little bit of insight into what we do and can find point. First and foremost, the vast majority of all cases are insurance and workers' compensation fraud. The most classic ones: a guy falls at work, hurts his back, and I find him shoveling snow at his house. Woman is supposed to be on crutches, she's bebopping around the mall. Guy is supposed to be in a sling and he's whitewater rafting. You get the idea. Point. The domestic cases, cheating, etc., are kind of rare because most of the time we price out customers once we lay out our fees and then inform them that it could take several days of surveillance to find anything. If we find anything, that's usually where the conversations ends. I feel like most people expected us to have 4K video of their partner making out with their lover in broad daylight in about 20 minutes. Insurance companies have no problem paying, because even if we find something damning in 10% of cases, then make up the costs for them a 100-fold on one case. Point. The job is often painfully boring. Lots of windshield time, books on tape, fast food. Sometimes the people we are sent to surveil are genuinely hurt. Sometimes they just don't leave their house, or their lawyer tells them that they will likely be followed by a PI, so they hunker down. Sometimes they are on the lookout for you, so you get made right away. Comes with the job. The pay was great, the hours lousy, and it was 95/5 boring to super exciting. A great job for a single guy in his early 20s. Not sure I could do it now. As for the most interesting story, is I once saw an attempted murder. I was working a typical case where a woman supposedly had a back injury. She and this other guy were instead taking down a campsite. So, I propped my camera up on a tripod from another campsite and just sat in a camping chair looking inconspicuous. At some point another guy drives up at a campsite and fires off 6 rounds at the couple. I didn't get the entire thing in frame, but the guy didn't even look like he came close to hitting them. Anyway, that video was taken into evidence, and it took about 2.5 years to get it back, so the insurance company could go back and make a case against her for fraud. Ask anything else you want to know about the world of private investigating. So my mother had a feeling my stepfather was cheating on her, so I was off college for the summer and offered to stake him out one day. So every morning he would leave for work at 8 am, but she said he had suddenly been leaving at 7 o'clock with no explanation. So I parked my car down the street from our house instead of near our driveway, brought my camera with zoom lenses early one morning, and waited. He leaves at 7 o'clock on the dot, and instead of going toward the city like he normally does, he makes a right turn at the first intersection out of sight of our house. Okay, so this is getting interesting. So I'm following at a distance, worried that he might recognize my orange colored car. He makes a few more turns and now he's going in the opposite direction towards his work. Does he know I'm following him? He goes about 2 more miles into some suburban neighborhood, and suddenly he parks the car outside some house. So I find a place to park, and then get out with my camera and cover it with the bottom of my shirt. Strolling around across the street from these row houses. After about 15 minutes, he comes out of the house and is standing on the steps waiting, so I duck behind some bushes. I start taking photos. Suddenly this woman I've never seen before comes out. I'm taking photos as the two of them walk down to his car, get in, and drive away. I was parked across the street further away in the other direction, and by the time I could get back to my car, they were long gone. I gave chase, but with all the traffic lights, knew I had lost them. Okay, day 2, I get my buddy to come with me. So again, we follow him as he leaves the house, goes to this woman's home, parks the car, goes in. This time we park about 5 houses down behind his car, so when they come out, we can follow them. Like clockwork the two come out, and get in the car and drive away. And we are now tailing them. Let me tell you, following someone with morning rush hour is not that easy. I didn't want to be directly behind them, but cars kept cutting in, and I was getting further and further away. Then came the red lights. I ran a couple late yellows, and in some cases even ran some reds, when I was sure there was no traffic coming either way. Hey, I was young and stupid and this was a real adventure. We are now going into the city, while he worked in a complex south of the city, so I had no idea of his destination. We get into downtown, and I'm afraid I have lost him. There were now at least 15 cars between us, and my friend and we're having trouble sighting them. But then as luck would have it, they turned into a parking lot and parked the car. So I park illegally on the street, because there were no legit parking spots. Figure I'd take my chances with any meter maids. We get out of our car and try to get as close as possible to where his car is parked in this huge parking lot, since they have not gotten out of their car. As we get closer, we see them sitting there and talking in the car. Suddenly, they start kissing. Totally making out. I get my camera out and take dozens of photos of the meeting face. They finish and she then gets out of the car and heads off to some office job, I presume. He starts the car up and leaves, presumably going off to work. The photos were a gold mine and my mother's lawyer said good work. On my wife's side, circa 2000 her grandfather passed away. Couple of years later her grandmother meets this gentleman who was in his 70s. Charming, very polite and respectful. They start dating, and after a little while decide to get married. Both widows at the time. Mother-in-law who is a special kind of person who will be going to the special kind place, and her bride sister decide it's a terrible idea. The guy's probably after her money and her house. No money and a house that's almost falling apart. Hire a pie to follow him around. Pie reports that there is nothing weird going on. He is indeed a widower, has a couple of kids who live out of state. He lives in a modest apartment and is just a regular guy. Only thing is he visits once a week an upscale retirement place, so upscale and so classy that the pie can't even get into the front door. Security is super tight. Mill and bride sister take this information to him and demand he tell them what he does there. The gentleman tells them to pound sand. They then contact an uncle, dead father's brother, who is lawyer to get power of attorney over elderly mother, wife's grandmother, to stop her from getting married. Uncle lawyer is like, nope, not doing that. She deserves to be happy and is of sound mind. Finally they find a lawyer who will take the case, but he charges them a ton upfront, of course. Point by this time they have made such a mess of things and harassed this gentleman so much and made his life so miserable that he just feels it's not worth it and breaks everything with wife's grandmother. Mill and bride's sister decide to proceed with taking power of decision from their old widow mother. Tons of men around who want to scam her and take her money. They have to go for a meeting with a pre-trial judge or someone. I don't know what it's called. It's before they meet the judge and go to court. This guy has the power to decide if they go to court or not. Two lawyers in suits show up representing widow grandmother and basically proceed to crush and destroy Mill and bride's sister's attorney. It was epic. Long story short, old gentleman was loaded like millions loaded. The person he was visiting in the retirement community was his 98-year-old mom. The reason the pie couldn't get in or find any information on it was because it was so exclusive that even retired senators and VIP of all kind of sorts retired there. They even had butlers and gourmet chefs on staff. Top of the top place. Grandmother died sometime later, broke, miserable and pissed at her daughters. She got the last laugh at the end and left her shitty house to her son, who never got involved in his crazy sister's shit. He is an okay guy, had the house demolished, sold the land. Not a pie, but my wife's brother is, and I'm curious about the ethics of the pie business. Recently, Thanksgiving 2019, my mother-in-law started living with us, and she visited with her son, wife's pie brother, a month after moving in for Christmas. He made a comment to her that he investigated me on his own. He claimed that he spoke to my ex-wife, previous marriage, and that she filed for divorce because of adultery. However, we divorced under unreconcilable differences because we married young and probably were two people who just shouldn't have been married. At the time of the divorce there were no claims of adultery, and the divorce was handled swiftly because we wanted nothing to do with each other anymore. It was about 2 months after the divorce was final that I found evidence that she had cheated on me towards the end of the marriage, but divorce final and no ties to the ex, so I let it go because she was gone. Background: wife's brother is a pie, but also a mooch, who caused a car that my now wife co-signed prior to marriage on to get repoed because he stopped making payments. I commented how that was a crap move and called him a dirtbag. Guy disliked me ever since. So, can a pie just investigate anyone for any reason? This is in Texas, by the way. Also, would there be grounds to report him to the state for an ethics violation? For the record, there was no adultery on my part. I made that clear to my now wife and mother-in-law, and they were understanding, but his claims caused a rift that took almost a year to subside between my wife and I. That my employee was scamming the Workers' Compensation Board and my company by claiming a terrible back injury that happened at work, which no one saw, that he deserved to have covered by WCB insurance, which ends up raising the premiums my company pays next year, sometimes by tens of 1,000s depending how long he's on it. And other factors. Some of our other employees saw him posting on Instagram about how he was building his mom's deck, mixing and pouring concrete, painting and sandblasting stuff, etc., and they were frankly mad, so they told me about it. To be clear, I have zero problem with employees who legitimately get injured at work using WCB insurance. They should use it, that's what it is there for. I'm not okay with people lying about it to get paid time off to build mom's deck. Point: I hired a pie to spend a few days telling him cheap money compared to how high my WCB premiums were due to rise next year if we just accepted this. He skipped his physio appointments that he was supposed to be doing to recover as fast as possible. Worker is responsible, if claiming compensation insurance, to minimize their time on it by doing their exercise and physio to get back to work as soon as possible. It's not supposed to be abused by dragging out recovery and not trying to get better, and spent the vast majority of his time, 8 to 10 hours a day, working in his mom's yard doing decidedly physical work that one should not be capable of if recovering from a serious back injury. The Pies videos combined with the Instagram stories of him bragging about how much work they hammered out that day, and then some additional things that came out from the WCB officer assigned to the case regarding some inconsistencies in his story and the timing of things, caused the compensation board to dismiss his case and order him to pay back the funds received. We were also allowed to fire him with prejudice. Satisfying result for myself and my company. TLDR, hired a pie to tail an employee suspected of faking an injury to claim workers' compensation insurance. Turns out he was faking it. Board agreed, stripped him of his insurance protections, and ordered him to pay back the funds received, and we fired him with prejudice. I've done some cybersecurity research for a pie and have run into a seemingly normal lady being freaked out that her wealthy husband was spying on her, having people do stuff to her house. Most notability, she pointed at her walls and picked out a paintbrush fiber, which she described as a fiber optic listening device. Next day she was destroying her clothes and purses that had silver fibers or electrical fibers for listening, as she put it. I stopped working with her shortly after. A client passed away, and his caretaker/mistress and her family stole around $1 million of goods and loaded up in the only blind spot of the estate. She may have contributed to his death, but is a pro-con artist and left only dead ends. A prospective client wanted me to find resources on the dark web to illegally hack their daughter's accounts because she stopped all communication. She was a Yale grad that went to Emory and was rising in the ranks due to potentially sleeping with superiors. Oh, and she was possibly hanging with some big time drug dealers with mob ties. I don't like jail or the mob, so I declined. A super rich guy in the country was so sure his wife was cheating on him. One day he pulled up a grainy feed from a cheap Walmart camera and shouted, "Look, there's an ass." And another, "It's an orgy. Hurry, we have to catch them. You drive and I'll keep monitoring." He then pressures me to speed like hell during a rainstorm to make it home. It was nothing. Turns out he was out of his oxy supply and getting super paranoid. Next meeting he kicked me out while I was installing new equipment so he can track MAC addresses while yelling, "You get the fuck out of here. It's you." Very awkward moment. An attorney, a scorned trust fund CEO, a Sugaba B, lots of money, probably some drugs, and a web of conspiracy. I was brought in to help identify anything digitally that could provide proof. My mother used a pie so many times when I was a kid, even I was on a first name basis with him. Tony was someone my grandfather used a lot for labor related issues. The NLRB had no balls in the 80s, so he came cheap as a favor the first few times with Dad, who'd made a hobby out of dodging child support. We weren't hurting, and he always paid in the end, but only a weekend in jail cured him of trying. Next was a peeping Tom. We'd tried police, cameras, sensor lights, waiting up with a borrowed Starlight scope, you name it. Tony had him in 2 hours, based on old police reports. Tom turned out to be a guy down the street who was about 12 mentally and just liked watching other people because he had no friends. Apps got him into a program, he got a friend, and bang. No more peeping Tom. Then there were all the times Mom used him when she worked for a women's shelter. Tony would drop by just after I got out of school with an envelope of documents to say, "Tell ya ma the asshole moved his mistress in, or so and so is banking at Wells Fargo now and just used his wife's credit to buy a Lincoln and I'd pay him with cash my mother had stuck to the side of the fridge with a magnet." Knowing Tony as a kid has forever ruined my image of pies in fiction. They're all manly, broad-shouldered womanizers with a rough past and alcoholism, like Mike Hammer or Thomas Magnum. Not Tony. He was a tiny little gay Mexican I was taller and heavier than at 13 who didn't drink and wouldn't work Sunday morning because he had to take his mother to church. A lady stole my kitten. My mom used to rent rooms of our house to make ends meet. Beach, as I'll call her, lived with us for a couple years until my mom put the house on the market. Beach woke up my mother on the day she was supposed to move out, saying that her sister, who she was supposedly moving in with, agreed to let her foster one of my cats, and she wanted to foster my kitten. My mom agreed and wrote up a contract for Beach to sign, and she left with my less than a year old kitten. who we will call baby. Here's the list of sheet that came to light over the next couple weeks. She tried to take both copies of the contract my mother wrote up to read at home and mail back. My mother fortunately copied the contract one more time before sending her with 2 copies. The address written on the contract was not where Beach lived, where baby was kept, nor was it the home of Beach's sister. Beach ghosted all messages. All of them. Even the ones from me, the 19-year-old legal owner of baby, who just wanted to check in on baby's well-being and deliver her favorite toy. Beach's sister would not speak to us at all for several months. That was pretty much as bad as it gets. The only thing that would have been more evident of theft is a confession. We planned to threaten Beach with a lawsuit to scare her into giving baby back. We couldn't deliver her court summons if we didn't have an address for her, so we hired a PI to find her. We did not. Fortunately, this story has a happy ending. A strongly worded email from a renowned animal crimes lawyer scared Beach into returning baby. It's been several months since, and she's happy as a clam and just loves to terrorize my older cat. TLDR. Beach not very subtle stole my kitten, and it took a PI and a specialized animal related crimes lawyer to get her back. I was hired by a PI to advertise his service. I had noticed he wasn't on the popular review site Yelp. I offered to be his first Yelp review in exchange for an investigation of my own, where he'd be following me around. Once I left his office, I drove to a nearby hotel without being followed, where I met up with about a dozen impersonators. I taught them all my mannerisms and had told them to leave, but kept the man who looked most like me around. If someone was going to be me, then who was going to be him? He agreed to swap lives for the rest of the day and gave me the keys to his car and the location of his apartment. I was also informed that he had a fiancée, so I stopped off to buy some flowers for her. We had left the hotel and drove to each other's houses. The PI was obviously expecting this, so I had my doppelganger bring in a box of beverages to my house to avoid a clear shot of his face. Once I arrived at my impersonator's house, his fiancée answered the door and I introduced myself as him. She didn't buy it initially and had decided to call her actual fiancé to end this entire thing. The ruse being up, I defeatedly drove home to confront the PI and inform him that he had won and tracked me down properly. But I still had an ace up my sleeve. Offering to get drinks with him, the PI told me to hop in his car. I had walked around back and sneakily swapped places with another impersonator. As he entered the car, I was running down the street, trying to shake the trail this PI had on me. He got 5 stars. So usually my first instincts of a person are correct. I'm not saying I have some special skill, I just tend to read people well. This failed me miserably a couple years ago. We had a rather large men's group at church and we began a study on what porn does to the brain, sex trafficking, and how it messes with relationships. I'm not preaching at anybody, but this is relevant to the story. Anyways, one of the guys starts talking about his time as a sheriff and all the horror stories that go into it. I'm talking detailed stories about finding children and busting up sex trafficking stuff. I had quite a few unsettling nights during this time because of how graphic it got. We let him tell his stories because it honestly helped quitting porn for a while, and we thought it was helping him get through his past. Fast forward a couple months after the study had ended, and the guy up and disappeared. Left his wife, took his car and vanished. Another sheriff had joined the church and got to talking to the guy that was supposedly a sheriff in his past. Homeboy got spooked and ran. His wife hired a PI and his whole life story was fake. I'm talking about, he wasn't a sheriff, wasn't ex-military, wasn't from the same state, etc. Hell, the name he went by wasn't even his real name. He was the most convincing liar I have ever met. When he told sad stories he would cry, had an infectious laugh, and always had a smile and time to talk. We had no idea. 2019, my wife's family sent us to Asia to try help out a business her dad had invested in. It's a long story, but we hired a PI and basically found out that my father-in-law, M75, partner, F55, is the center of massive con job. She's pulled every imaginable con possible, but the biggest one was getting him to invest in her family's businesses in her home country. She's managed to swindle him out of around $3 million over a 10-year period. The pie basically put together a scenario based on her age and the village area she came from to her always living in the red light district in the city where she is from. He said she would have moved there at 17 to 18-year-old and worked as a prostitute until she was about 35. Then when she was too old to prostitute, she would have gone to another country to work as a maid or masseuse and found a target to start manipulating money out of. He said once they get their hands on a man and start giving him a massage, the money starts disappearing from his wallet. We asked my father-in-law to be honest and tell us the first time he met her, what happened. He said she came to give him a massage. On further investigation we also found that she was exactly 35 at the time and that she became his mistress 5 years before my wife's mother had died. We are currently trying to recover around $2 million worth from the investment fraud side of things, but court cases have been delayed for a year due to covered points. So much more to the story. I'm thinking of writing a book about it all. I was my own pie once. I had an accident that felt like I was being scammed, but looked like it was my fault. Unbeknownst to the would-be scammers, I'm super paranoid, and as such I had a dash cam. The NYPD no longer show up to accidents unless there's an injury. An officer passing by informed us of this and watched as we exchanged info. I gave the scammer my registration and license to take pictures, but I keep my insurance digital. He only gave me his license and claimed it was a friend's car. He didn't have the papers. My insurance claimed not to be able to find the insurance policy based on a license plate in New York and suggested I go through my full coverage and pay the deductible. The driver stopped answering his phone and refused to send me his insurance info after I provided mine. So I ran the plate myself and got an address. Same address as the driver's license. So I showed up and asked the other tenants for him and told them exactly why I was there. Then I knocked on neighbors' doors and did the same. The guy no longer lived there, but someone told me where he worked and his employer was informed that he was refusing to give me his insurance info after an accident. Eventually the guy called me back and asked me why I was defaming him. He sent me his insurance card and guess what? Same company as mine. They were hoping to save the amount of my deductible by having me go through my own policy. I filed the claim and provided the insurance with the dashcam footage. I also filed a report with the state for his refusal to provide insurance information and the false report he made to my insurance company and against my insurance company for not being able to find the policy when he's insured by them. In the end I collected $3,500 for minor damage to my car. All because I spent a couple hours using the info I had to gain more. Found my BO dad this year about 2 months after the pandemic shut most things down. This was my second attempt at a pie. I only gained confidence to try again after discovering DNA relation to his half-sister / my aunt on one of those DNA websites. The pie first came back and said he was dead. Sent me an obituary and everything. It appears that I'd missed him by a year. I sent that to my aunt and she said it wasn't him due to the name of their father listed in the obit being incorrect. I'll let the pie know, and within 24 hours, they found the right guy. Gave me his phone number, which I called that day, and he picked up on the second ring. This would be a happy ending, except holy shit, I have a half sister through him who kinda looks like me. I also have 3 close siblings through my mom. Wouldn't say we favor as much physically, so I was super stoked to meet her. Except my BO dad has declined at every inquiry to share her number. I've sent her a Facebook message, but she's a young millennial, so she probably doesn't use it as much. He told me her mom died of cancer this year, and she has 3 young boys. I can only imagine how difficult that must be, especially during the pandemic, and it sounds like she and BO dad also have an estranged relationship. I'm giving it one more go at asking for him to introduce us, and then I'm hiring a pie to find her. I need peace of mind and to also give her the big sister love and Christmas gifts I got her and the boys. My wife and I had a deposit amount we put down on a house for rent stolen by the landlord. We gave the landlord the money to secure first right of refusal on the house. But we did have the right to refuse the house after a specified period, as it was in the process of being renovated and we couldn't move in right away. When the time came to move forward, we had made alternate living arrangements and asked for our deposit money back, which we never received. We tried to be civil and asked the landlord to return our contractual owed sum back to us, which he never did. After months of back and forth, he completely disappeared. We filed a claim in small claims court. He never showed up to the hearings, feeling left with little other options. We hired a PI to investigate the landlord so we could find out his address to serve him papers on behalf of the court. This man was a slippery guy with numerous previous addresses, PO boxes, no known family. It was straight out of a bad movie. The PI did his best to illuminate everything that he could, legally, and not much was discovered. He had several liens on his bank accounts from not paying his taxes. Numerous other small claims court cases filed against him, never resolved. Ultimately what we learned was this guy was a pose that has spent his life scamming people and living a shady life outside of the law. Overall, I'd describe the process as cathartic, in that we did what we could, but also disheartening, because it was pretty much a dead end. Finn. I was the one being investigated, and it was the most bullshit experience of my life. My boyfriend had gone missing. Truth is, he committed suicide, but we didn't know that at the time. He was just missing. A PI talked to boyfriend's mom and offered to look into things, so I get a call. This PI keeps calling me Joey, which is not my real name. I wanted to try going by that name and started an email address with said name, but literally no one calls me that. I tell him that, and he says some people call you Joey. Okay, then pulls this. I can help you, Joey. The cops are getting closer, and if you cooperate they'll go easy on you. Just tell me where he is. I had no idea where he was. This guy was implying that my boyfriend had overdosed on drugs I had given him, specifically heroin. Nope. Then this PI hits me with this. What were you doing in Louisville? What the fuck? I had never been to Louisville. This PI is interrupting me, throwing all kinds of bullshit at me. I was 20 at the time, barely 100 lbs, and my boyfriend had disappeared. I was a wreck, just sobbing. It became too much, and I hung up, which I should have done immediately. The guy was wrong on literally every front. Note, I did talk to the cops. I was told they couldn't do anything unless I told the PI to cease and desist, and he continued anyway. So I did what the cop said to do, and he left me alone after that. I almost wished he had kept trying, so I could press charges. He was incompetent and just awful. Former PI here. One thing I really enjoyed about the work was that it was rarely the same day twice. I started out all the personal stuff the exact same way by asking the question, "Are you sure you want to know the truth?" I found some really interesting truths. You learn real fast that everything is possible, no matter how horrible or disgusting it is. Abuse, infidelity, fraud, and deception are your bread and butter. Sure, there were some funny and weird ones. I had a few that resembled X-rated Scooby-Doo stories. I caught things that the police couldn't find. Sometimes the only way I could sleep at night were if after the close of an investigation, a folder might find its way on someone's desk, anonymously. Of course. So, ladies, if you think he's cheating on you, he might be, but it's never the one you think. More often it's not the new intern or the brand new secretary, but it's the cleaning lady that does the thing you refuse to. Or, it might be he is taking dancing lessons in secret to surprise you for the big party. Fellas, she might be cheating on you, but it's not the stud at the supermarket. It's most likely your best friend, or perhaps her lady golf/tennis coach. Or, she's been working down at the club because she knows you lost your job and the kids need braces. People will constantly fuck each other over, and even the smallest amount of money. It's never the ex-con trying to right himself. It's always Karen, in accounting. In fraud cases, it's never some big reveal. It's always just following their social media and waiting for the right picture. Custody stuff is always horrible, so try to remain civil and don't get greedy. My Australian auntie was happily married to a Vietnamese man with a young daughter. When daughter was 6 in the 70s, her father went back to Vietnam for his annual holiday to see his family, who he supported with his Australian wages. He never returned from that trip. His brother, the only family member my auntie had ever spoken to because he was the only one who spoke English, told my auntie he had died in an accident, but something didn't seem right to her. The brother wouldn't give many details, or they were conflicting. Said he'd already been buried, and there was no point in her flying over. It was all too weird, so she hired a PI, with financial help from our family. It took them a while to figure it all out, but the brother wasn't his brother, he was just a friend of the husband's who was covering for him for 10 years of my auntie's marriage. Turns out the husband had a wife and 6 children back in Vietnam, who were told he lived in Australia 11 months a year to support them. Postscript, auntie was an incredible woman, did very well in her profession and happily remarried. Our family never spoke the husband's name again. As an adult, my cousin traveled to Vietnam and met her siblings and grandmother, who had never been told about her. The father and his wife refused to see her. She was fine with that. My wife and I hired a pet detective earlier this year. We have a large number of cats, and 6 of them were Sphinx. 4 of them ran outside when I accidentally left the door to our screen and porch open. 3 of them ran back inside as soon as we came tearing outside. Potter did not point. We were able to get our animal behavioralist, that is, pet detective, with a tracking dog, to come out 5 days later. She talked to us about strategies for getting PO back, like putting up trail cameras and live catch traps baited with mackerel. Canned mackerel is nasty shit, by the way. Talking to all of our neighbors, getting flyers up everywhere, etc. One of our neighbors had caught him on a security camera 3 days earlier, and so that's where we started with the tracking dog. We used one of PO's favorite toys. I'd bagged it and put it in the freezer about a day after we lost him and picked up his trail. The dog led us around, and we found a place where he'd been hanging out at an unoccupied home. We kept trying to pick up PO's trail out of there, and the dog started to head out into the woods, and then just stopped. The dog couldn't pick up an exit trail, no matter how we looked. We bought live catch traps and trail cameras. Do not buy Will Jame Innovation cellular trail cameras. I spent hours dealing with tech support and could not get the faking things to work right, and put them in all of the areas that PO had been staying. We caught raccoon and opossums in the traps and managed to catch deer and some hikers on the trail cameras, but we didn't find PO. We knocked on every door in our area, left flyers and posted them on mailboxes, and nothing. After about 3 months of looking, we had to accept what the dog was trying to tell us all along. PO had been caught and killed where the trail ended. We don't know if it was a coyote, a bear, the bobcat that we've seen a few times, a hawk, or what, but he's gone, and he's not coming back. I still miss PO and all his goofiness. I was in college and had a wild night. I slept with a girl at a party and went home. So, the next day I get a call from the police because they were investigating an incident at the party. Turns out this random girl claimed she was raped by me at the party. Basically my whole life and future looked like it was gone, and I was done for. But in reality she came on to me and asked me for sex. So my family hired a PI and he went to work. Over the course of 2 weeks he was able to find a pattern of overdrinking and issues at home due to drinking. That night she got caught drinking again and told her parents that a bunch of guys held her down and forced her to drink and then raped her. My PI was able to get her on a phone call with her best friend, who knew what was actually going on, to admit they made the whole thing up to avoid trouble at home by throwing me under the bus for a potential life as a sexual offender and rapist. Since he had it recorded, my lawyer submitted the tape to the police and they dropped the case instantly. The school was not happy that one of their students had gotten away with rap on campus, so they suspended me for sexual harassment under Title IX for 2 semesters. Lesson learned here is that it was against school policy to have consensual sex on campus. I did end up finishing college, but that was honestly the scariest time in my life. I didn't trust women for years and didn't date for what felt like an eternity, 4 years. I'm now happily engaged to a wonderful woman who loves me, and I cannot wait for our wedding next spring. To the friend that was willing to get some guy she didn't know, me, out of trouble for sleeping with her drunk friend. You are the real hero of the story. TLDR in college, got accused of rap, even though she came on to me. Pi was able to discover she was lying to cover her ass for being an alcoholic to her parents. Late to the party, so doubt this gets any attention, but figured I'd share some. I'm a work comp adjuster, so I deal with Pies fairly often. I'll say this, most of the time you really don't find much point. The best instance was a guy claiming bilateral wrist injuries for overexertion/repetitive motion. Has an attorney and they are suing. Mind you, we accepted the claim, but we got word that this dude actually likes to dabble in MMA. We put a Pi on him, that got him competing in MMA events. Claim was then promptly denied. His attorney dropped the case. He got nothing. Another case, where a woman was claiming a low back injury that was so bad she couldn't even ride in the car. She would be in literal tears at work claiming the back injury was horrendous. This all smelled like bullshit to me, and I had a feeling she was full of it. Put surveillance on her which had her easily walking around, carrying children, hauling large hauls of laundry, driving, everything you do in a normal day with zero issues. Showed it to the doctor which immediately discharged her from care, said she abused his trust, and wouldn't see her anymore. While this story doesn't have anyone getting caught doing blatant fraud, it made me laugh. Pi noted that they were in the parking lot when a local tow company truck entered the lot. All of a sudden all the tenants of the apartment complex were running out to move their cars. Another instance where we didn't hire a Pi, but some anonymous citizen submitted evidence which cracked me up, as this guy was clearly a co-worker of the individual and hated this claimant. Claimant was alleging a back injury from lifting a box. This anonymous citizen submitted photos of this guy doing a complete remodel of his home with written documentation of the times and everything. This report was dropped on the desk of the work comp insurance administrator for our state. My wife and I hired a Pi to find where her ex was working and to serve him with papers for a legal action. We could never get him served at his house because he'd refuse to answer the door. It really is that easy. The guys were great and worked in a bail bonds office, both young, ex-military, and had an almost Boy Scout-like enthusiasm for new projects. They performed an initial survey of ex's house and presented us with a PowerPoint showing the plan to sneak onto the property under cover of darkness, plant a tracking device on his car, then get out. Risks and emergency egress routes identified. Google Maps with lines and arrows. It was both hilarious and awesome. They tracked him to an office out in an office park some 25 miles from his home. They asked if we could predict his patterns. My wife said he typically went to work very early, then went for coffee around 9 AM. Sure enough, they went to his workplace and found his car by itself. Few other people had arrived. Right on the money. He came out to his car to go for coffee and they served him, providing us photos of the whole thing. Photo 1. Fatus standing by his car looking puzzled at some strange young guy coming towards him. Photo 2. Fatus looking annoyed that he'd been served as young guy is running away from him, back towards his partner/driver waiting in the truck. Photo 3. Fatus throwing the served papers on the ground in disgust as he got into the car. Photo 4. Fatus reaching down to retrieve the served papers. That the Henderson and Las Vegas police totally didn't do their jobs when it came to my brother's murder. Any possible leads were left hanging, and it pushed through the case. Basically one person killed a day in around that area, so he was just lost in paperwork, evidence lost, or can't be seen, so the private investigation could only go so far. We know who did it. He was the one scamming my brother for insurance. Yet police did prosecute and told us if we pushed too early he might be found innocent. Only so much my parents could do from Michigan. We aren't rich and can't afford to be in Nevada for the whole case. Link to and article. Basically he was trying to start a church business with his so-called friend DJ. DJ tricked him into signing life insurance paperwork saying it was health insurance stuff. My brother hasn't done anything like that before, so I'm sure he trusted the guy and just signed it. Then one day months later, called my brother over to work out, which they often did. So he jogged over and was jumped by some people. Beaten and strangled, I guess. Supposedly it was DJ's brother who actually did it. But no one has gotten official proof. Only thing we had was insurance fraud. Police told us not to prosecute for that, since they wanted murder charges. Insurance company just red flagged it and didn't pay out. But he never was arrested for anything, and this was 10 years ago. It was a total mess. All we could do was watch from 2,500 miles away. My family hired a private investigator to look into my stepmother. When my father passed away, my sister and I were both set to receive $250K from the life insurance policy. When he passed away from a morphine overdose while on hospice, I was informed by my stepmother that my sister and I were never beneficiaries on the policy. My grandparents were out of the country and wanted an autopsy as they believed she possibly overdosed him on morphine. She had him cremated before any order could be gained for an autopsy. The private investigator found that she has been a career extortionist and has committed fraud on many occasions. She emptied her own father's bank account and maximumed out his credit cards the week he passed. She was caught pulling the jewelry off her own dead sister's body minutes after she passed. She's been to prison for a financial crime involving some type of credit card fraud. On top of everything, she was my abuser when I was a child. Very graphic and disturbing physical abuse I'd rather not detail. I didn't dare tell anyone because I had a fear that she'd hurt my sister. My first impression of her was pretty bad. Nearly 30 years ago I overheard her in the kitchen on the phone. She thought everyone was in the backyard. She said, "I got me a white boy, yeah himo, and he's got money. You should see the house. Yep. Oh yeah. Boat, hot tub, so much sheet. His ex, my wonderful kindhearted mother, is a faking beach." I shouldered spoke up. "I don't even want the money. I just really didn't want her to get it. She's never worked a job while she's been with my dad. She bought a brand new 70-inch TV the day after he died. A new car a week later. Sold his house within the year. Had a new live-in boyfriend at her new place within the year, which the pie confirmed she had been in contact with the last several months of my father's life. So I didn't exactly hire her, but someone I worked with was retiring and was going to spend her days being a PI, which was pretty cool, I thought, and I asked her if she could help me with something that had bothered me since I was 12 years old. My father, who was living across the country at the time, flew to see me and my brother just for a day. I would find out years and years later that the reason he did that was that he had cancer and wasn't sure if he was going to die or not. My dad doesn't talk about anything. He's the weirdest guy, like ever. This brings me to the conversation we had that day. He told us that before he met our mom, he had knocked up this girl he worked with and she kept the baby. He had no relationship with her at all or her mother. He claims he wanted to, but she didn't want anything to with him. But knowing my dad, I'm pretty sure that's all bullshit. I bet he just bailed. He said he just wanted us to know that we had a half sister, and then he just left. Like I mentioned before, weird guy. So it was always in the back of my mind that I had a half sister out there somewhere, and I was always curious about her, but my dad never brought it up again the few times a year he bothered talking to me at all. So I didn't know how I could find her. I tried searching the internet a few times, Facebook and things like that, but not sure. So fast forward to when my coworker tells me she's gonna be a PI. It hit me. I told her the story, asked her what she would need to figure out who she was, and she said just my dad's name and job, and she might be able to come up with something. Not even 2 weeks later, my amateur PI buddy is messaging me on Facebook and sends me to the woman she believes is my half sister. I remember it exactly because at the time I was out at a bar with my sister, Step, and when we saw the photo we both looked at each other and were like, that's gotta be her. Just had a strong feeling. So in the time from when my dad told me about her to the time the PI had found her, 14 years. I'd moved back to where I was born. From what I could see on Facebook, my half sister lived within 30 minutes, had just given birth, had a husband, and she just overall seemed really happy and cool. I reached out to her, sent her a message on Facebook explaining who I was. I had no idea if she knew about me or not. So I told her I didn't want anything. I just wanted her to know that I knew that we probably had the same dad, and then I waited, wondering if I should be upset about something that I never had in the first place. It took her almost a year to respond. The message went to some folder and she never saw it, but then she did. She confirmed that she was my half sister. We exchanged a few messages back and forth before finally meeting for lunch one day. It was a little awkward at first, but we are both a little awkward. And that's actually what was so crazy to me. The weird similarities we had with each other. The whole thing has been kinda surreal point. Since then we've met up for lunch a few different times and went to a concert together. I've never told my dad that I have a relationship with her. I told my half-sister that if she wants me to tell him anything, then I will, or put them in contact. But other than that, I don't see why I would. And he missed out big time, as far as I'm concerned. Because she's awesome. I wish I saw more of her. In fact, I'm gonna text her right now and see if she's free for lunch. TLDR, an amateur PI helped me get in contact with my half-sister, who is a badass and who's a company I really enjoy. Worked at an extremely overbearing company that micromanaged their employees, but this was one time their paranoid behavior paid off. We had a guy that called out due to his father-in-law falling ill. After a few days he came back and said it was only a matter of time and family was flying in to be with him in his last few days. Co-worker was out for 2 weeks after that, saying he was dealing with the funeral arrangements and helping with family tasks, which there are a lot of, and the whole time people are consoling him through this. I had just lost my father, so I had a long talk with him and probably got choked up a few times. Others were coming up to him and sharing their lost stories, giving hugs, crying, etc. After 2 weeks he emailed everyone an obituary, but at the bottom of the page, it said unverified, so it was clearly written by him. The boss decided to hire a PI and lo and behold the employee was seen at the movies, amusement park and just chilling at the house with his wife. Come to find out, his wife's BO father was alive and well, and the guy that died was her mother's ex-husband that hadn't been in the picture for decades. TLDR, a dude faked the death of his make-believe in-law and let people think he was going through a close loss so he could take a 3-week vacation. He was promptly fired in the parking lot when he eventually showed back up to work. What a psychopath. Not a pie, but I had to do some deep investigation to support a legal case against a customer. Customer had not paid property charges, trying to keep it vague here, for a number of years, and had been sent to the solicitors for non-payment about 18 months prior, but the case had staggered multiple times. He was a real kin moaning about every non-issue despite never paying a single freaking bill. I went through the entire history and poked huge gaping holes in every flimsy excuse he had given us and the solicitors over the years. I took photos of all the reported problem areas to prove there were none. Proved where he lied about agreements with management, etc. Everything we would need if it went to court. But the best part was that he had pleaded poverty with the solicitors, and that's why the case stalled. Claimed his only income was JSA. But I found the property on a number of property sites. He had been renting it out for years. Checked his correspondence address out, and he'd moved in with parents. But all solicitors' contacts so far had been via email. So I made sure to send a letter to him at parents' address, making him aware that we are pushing solicitors to move forward. His mum called a few days later in a panic saying, could we put it on hold for a bit as he was working abroad, and responding during working hours wasn't going to happen. But based off her info I was able to find he was working in a very wealthy country in a private boarding school as a teacher. When we pointed out that we had a slam dunk case, if we go to court, as we had lots of proof of lies, and knew he was fraudulently claiming JSA and not declaring 2 sources of income to HMRC, he quickly paid and never missed a payment again. I dated, yes, dated, a rich dude who hired a PI to verify if I was actually fishing or cheating. I got into fishing a few months ago, and I fell in love with it. Perfect hobby for an introvert. I'll fish after work for about 2 hours every day. On weekends I'll be up at 5 AM, ready to cast at 6, and finish up around 6 PM. Literally spend all day fishing, walking nature trails, enjoying a homemade quick lunch by the water. The only connection I'll have to society would be my phone. I'll take pics and selfies of the area and with my catches and send it to my parents. Plus dude I was dating. No FB, Instagram, or social media ho nonsense. Fairly chill. And thanks to Fishbrain Premium, I can see via GPS where local fishermen had confirmed catches, which permits me to travel around South Florida from fishing spot to spot. That's my weekend. fish from spot to spot, and I thoroughly enjoy it. Unfortunately for me, my guy's friends thought I was fishy. Lol. I would coordinate weekends with him, or end my fishing early. I balanced fishing and dating pretty well. But yeah, the guy I was dating was verbally poisoned by his friends into thinking he doesn't spend all day fishing. Definitely cheating. He hired a pie. I don't recall anyone, to be honest. I legit will find another fishing spot if someone is there. Get the fuck out of my introvert domain. I broke up with the guy. He'd text me all day, but when we get together he'd shuffle between being there or incredibly distant. As I was calling it off, he broke down and asked me to be honest, just tell him there's another guy. He told me he got so paranoid he hired someone, and when I asked him what the person found, nothing. Idiot. There was never anyone else. He apologized and wanted a second chance, but I ended it. Communication and trust resolved all of this. Even better? If he would have agreed to join me on my weekend fishing every single time I asked, or piped up early on when I asked him if everything alright. Gay dudes are faking drama. Goddamn. It's the reason why I stay away from gay cliques/large groups of friends when I'm in a relationship. None of them faking care or respect it. My cousins hired a pie to find their father, my Uncle Joe. This is all second or third hand info. My Uncle Joe and his wife Darla had 2 kids, boy Joe Jr. then girl Diane, in the 1960s. Darla was raised in a religious household. She walked in on Joe changing Diane's diaper when Diane was 8 months old and accused him of sexually molesting Diane. Joe had previously changed Joe Jr.'s diaper many times, but because Diane is a girl baby, a man changing her diaper is sexual. Don't ask me why. Legal stuff happens. Joe is totally cleared of any charges. Darla flips out, takes kids and hides for 15+ years. Joe tried finding his kids a couple of times. No luck. Remarries and has stepdaughter Joe Jr. and Diane grow up with semi-wackadoodle mom. Have been told dad is horrible monster but in the mid-80s, hire a pie anyway to find their dad, who lives about an hour away from them. Darla's hiding ability is revert to maiden name and live 3 blocks away from her parents. Yeah, I think Uncle Joe didn't really look at that hard and my cousins could have found their dad by looking in a phone book in the city they were born in. But hey, not all of my relatives are geniuses. I heard they paid $800 to the pie to find dad. The sad thing is, they all have contact and even socialize. But when the first grandchild is born, a boy, my Uncle Joe and his wife are all up that kid's ass. They take him on trips, buy him thousands of dollars of toys and clothes etc. The second grandchild was a girl, and it was like she didn't exist. Uncle Joe barely held her and never took her anywhere, and even the subsequent grandkids got the shaft. I didn't hire a pie, I became one. My dad was adopted in Philadelphia in 1953. Very little records. His orphanage apparently had a fire. Basically most of the documentation was lost. But a few years ago we did Ancestry. A third cousin randomly sends me a message as she figured out that her uncle had fathered a child no one knew about. Turns out his dad came from a rough upbringing, met my grandmother in HS while they were both excelling academically, and when she became pregnant the relationship he had with her family soured. My grandmother came from a small Korean family that lived in New York City but either moved or spent time in the Philly area. Her father was a surgeon. We learned a ton about his journey from Korea to Hawaii to PA as well. He was a nut. My dad was given up. His father ended up joining the military to pay for his undergrad at the same college her mother graduated from in Ohio. Seemed strange he graduated from Oberlin as he had no ties. He then went on to medical school in Germany, came back to Philly, and died a week before getting his medical license at the age of 33. In 1965, my grandmother went on to Wharton and became an economist, married a Lehman Brothers fellow graduate, and adopted a Korean girl in 1975 who is still in New York City with her celebrity bartender husband. My grandmother divorced, and I spoke with his sister who had no idea that my dad was born. Her ex-husband has passed, though like I mentioned I did contact his sister. I found a ton of records via their alma maters. If someone is deceased, it often becomes public, depends on the school. I found out a ton of info concerning relatives this way, as they happen to all receive degrees from various institutions. My maternal grandmother is still alive. I have her address on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, and her phone number. My dad wrote her a letter, but she never responded. Her daughter worked as a pastry chef at a restaurant that is now closed due to COVID. I have no idea if she knows about my dad. I'm going to make contact some way. I don't live far from New York City, so when it's safe, I plan on trying to go to the restaurant where I know her husband worked last. I found them on social media, but they are not active. Abs didn't read my messages. We were happy to have a lot of questions answered, though they were tough to hear. I also found my grandfather and great-grandfather are buried 20 minutes from my house. I ran over to pay my respects. Ancestry.com is a pie. I'm doing a course as a private investigator in Vienna, and already heard some stories people do. Usually people that become mad at the company, and especially long working mad employees, are the potential candidates for stealing in the company. It's amazing why people steal in the supermarket. People buy expensive things, but steal the batteries. When asked why they steal the batteries, they tell you they are not willing to pay for batteries when they buy expensive stuff. The batteries should be included, they say. One person I do not understand are cheating husband/wives which cheat on their partner for years while their marriage is technically over. And also I don't understand the partners that are too stupid to understand that they are being cheated. Point story. A wife suspected his husband for cheating. She told a very long story what the husband does, where he works, when he gets out. She told that he is a high manager at a company. The only fact that was true was the car registration. And that's it. That guy already changed his high manager job to a low factory job in another company. That company he worked for was near the new woman. Fun fact, the new job was 20h/week instead 40h, but he kept the same leaving and returning times. First thing he did in the morning at 7 o'clock was going to a Wurst stand and get alcohol. Well, of course, if you have to keep two women happy you need to drink. And he was a heavy drinker. Next fun fact. The new woman was not younger or more beautiful. She was as ugly as his wife. Lol. Point. This man did not have the guts to get divorced with a wife after cheating 6 years. I have more of these stories if you want to hear them. So my grandfather had a best friend since they were in the orphanage together. Growing up his family was our family. Every holiday, every family gathering, and every event they were there. Now his kids were a bit younger than my parents, but still way older than me. They had 4 children, and one year I was at their house and noticed a 5th kid who was in a photo I never saw before. He stood out as he has different hair color and features than the rest. I never put much thought until a week later, when I finally thought to ask my grandfather. Apparently the oldest boy was completely removed out of the family. He was violent, did small crimes, did tons of hard drugs, and was just an overall bad person. Apparently in the 80s they all had enough and kicked him out and decided to completely cut him off. It was a family agreement which my grandfather kind of disagreed with, although he understood it. And everyone agreed to never discuss Chucky ever again. Well, around 2010 my grandfather was owed a favor from a pie. He knew his friend's wife always wondered what happened to the old Chucky, so he called the favor in. The pie tracked Chuck down in Denver living in a halfway house. Chuck had a long and impressive record under the new name he had taken up. Well, wouldn't you know it, the criminal justice system did not know his real name until Megan's Law was out into use. His last arrest had been for almost taping a young child. They took him out of the will and let him completely go. I mean, everyone was in on the secret, and for the first 28 years of my life my cousins, and my sister had no idea. Back in 2016 I was involved in a car accident that was not totally my fault. The woman admitted to the officer following me for 15 miles and brake checking me several times before I could finally get around when she rear-ended me. She tried to claim she was injured to get more money. I told my adjuster she was just fine after the accident, even bouncing her kid around on her hip like no big deal. My adjuster didn't help at all. So I went through this girl's Facebook and my dad would even drive my her place. What I found out was that she got into a physical fight with her mother-in-law and tried to blame her injuries on the accident. She was also needing money from her baby daddy who wasn't paying anymore. The police thought she and I were in cahoots for some reason and questioned me without end. I told my insurance that the office was harassing me with questions about why I was even on that side of town 10 minutes from my house. Why was I going home instead of the store like I said? So he assumed I was changing my story. I was not. I was simply scared because I didn't know this person and just the WKND prior. I'd heard on the news of this man getting shot in the head because he got in front of some dude who had a temper issue on Father's Day WKND. So I said I'm gonna go back home and hope she doesn't follow me. Safe to say she didn't get much and was also placed at fault for the accident. Used to be the manager of the media department at a leading investigative company. There were 2 insurance fraud claims that overlapped due to it being a boyfriend/girlfriend. So there were also 2 investigators following and video recording them. One day all hell broke loose and these 2 literally almost killed each other. They got in a fight in a parking lot, so the girlfriend got in the car and locked the guy out. As she tried to drive away, he hopped onto the trunk and held on for dear life as she raced down the road. At a red light, he was able to jimmy the trunk open and half his body was inside while the light turned green. So there's this flailing armed man hanging from her vehicle in back. She finally parks outside their residence, gets out of the car and starts tossing a 24-pack of water at him. He grabs a hold of her, whips her body onto the grass, then swaps places and gets in the front seat. She then hops in the trunk. He starts to swerve down the road and now she's just chilling in the trunk. A cop finally sees them and the car pulls over. She gets out of the trunk and he exits the vehicle. Before the cop gets out of his car, the boyfriend punches the girlfriend in the face and starts running. 2 police officers chase, taser him, and pin him to the ground. I was the first to watch both videos and overlap them for the clients to see the full picture. My boss told me if he didn't have to legally keep the videos private, he'd have sold them both to TMZ or some crazy news site. It was a 1 in a million cheat show. A pie called against my dad by his boss. Dad had a claim of a work injury and he had basically an extreme kind of trigger finger in both hands and couldn't open his hand after a particularly harsh work month. Multiple surgeons and doctors, MRIs, x-rays, and CT scans all confirmed his hands were faked from overexertion. It is similar to an injury that can be gotten by mountain climbers who overwork themselves, but worse because he didn't have time to rest due to his shifts. Boss was big mad that the doctors refused to do surgery on both hands at once because this doubles the off time/healing time. Doctors said it was an ethical issue because my dad's limited mobility in one hand was better than zero mobility during healing, so he could, wipe his own ass. The boss sent a pie after him in spite to find reasons to cancel the disability claim payments. During his recovery from surgery 1, he got bored and started a project. To be fair, my dad did build a patio with cement foundation and electric lighting during recovery from a critical hand surgery. He had trigger finger in every single finger to the point that he couldn't flex/extend any of his fingers. He is a poleman, climbs live wire electric poles, like rock climbing, to do work in windy valleys because a lift truck can't stabilize well enough in windy weather, where he does work that could kill him instantly and hurt the whole time he's dying if he sneezes wrong. After the court was shown the photos of his amazing patio build, taken over the course of 2 weeks, my cheeky dick of a dad said, if I had been using both hands, it would have taken me 2 days. I had to rely on my stepdaughter's husband to help, and he's a good kid, but he only weighs 90 pounds and can't lift more than an English bulldog in weight. He had MRIs, CT scans, x-rays, and multiple surgeons and doctors who confirmed that, yes, he had this problem and did undergo surgery. And yes, it was related to his work. It only developed after a natural disaster where he worked in 36-hour shifts with 24 hours off after, for a month. I didn't hire one, but my mom remembers seeing some following us when I was little. So when I was around 11, the Canadian government were putting these huge pole lines in people's backyards in BC to transfer electricity to the States. They wanted to put one in our neighbor's backyard, but had to use ours, which meant that they would be coming about a foot near our gas line with huge trucks. They wanted to take over our backyard, but my mom was willing to fight for my sisters and I's safety. But a big electrical company that is well known in the area didn't believe that my mom was single and was on her own with 2 kids, so they hired private investigators to see if my mom was lying or something so that they could use it against her. All they got was a single mom who walks with a cane, taking care of her 2 young kids and driving them to and from school. My mom could not work at the time, so she was on disability. The investigators thought they would capture my mom in some act so that the company didn't have to pay for a hotel for us, but they found nothing. They had to pay for a hotel for us, around 6 months I think, and my mom was able to make a bargain where instead of paying for 2 weeks at this same hotel, my mom wanted to use it somewhere else, Disneyland Resort, and they did. So all we had to pay for is our tickets into Disneyland, food, and anything else like toys and such. Didn't have to worry about the hotel, and it's a great memory for me amongst all that shit that went on. So I'm doing a course as a private investigator in Vienna and heard a lot from other detectives here. You maybe hear that foreigners steal, but the ones who steal are also native people for stupid reasons. My course trainer catched an lawyer stealing a toothbrush. You ask why? Because he was bored and wanted to get action and also did not want to pay for a toothbrush. Granners steal wine and expensive alcohol because they are bored or they have a bad life. There are some cases which are tragic, like people steal bread. Usually shopkeepers tell you not to get active in such cases because in Austria it's useless to sue them. They never see a court or so for stealing bread. Story. A client wanted to have a sweep in his apartment. This client was some kind of bodybuilder doing steroids or some kind of sheet. This is a check for bugs with or without radio signals. He put cash on the desk and insisted on having this sweep. As requested, a sweep team went to his apartment and started checking with RF antennas whether there are any bugs emitting radio. The sweeping device reacted near a wall, and that dude said that there was a signal in that wall. He was told that the sweeping devices reacted to the metal of the wall and there is no bug. That dude got aggressive and insisted on dismantling the wall. After signing a paper, that wall was dismantled and there was a metal wall for which the sweeping devices reacted. No bug was found. The dude still insisted on destroying the wall further and was convinced that there is a bug. He also said why he thinks that there is a bug. He said that there must be a bug with radio emission since he does not get an erection. The sweep team wanted to friendly ask him whether the steroids are affecting his potency, but they did not ask this question since this dude was super aggressive. After he said that the sweep team left the apartment, that guy sued the detectives. He lost at the court and started to be aggressive at the court too. He got incapacitated off a decision by court and a ward took care of his business. Not me, but a friend of mine got bit in the ears by the same pie he used. He had found a girl on an online dating site. They were both from the same rural county and she seemed very normal. After roughly 6 months of dating, he feels comfortable enough to propose. Said friend asked his pie cousin if he'd check her and her family to make sure there wasn't anything iffy. Here's the thing. Around our hometown, if you go to marry someone who legitimately has issues, someone will hear about the marriage and tell you it's a bad idea. Precisely 0 people did this. As you may have guessed, it's because her and her family are normal and very typical of our area. Farmers, Christians, 3 kids, you get the point. So for the 3 years they've been married, that check has presumably been totally under wraps. The problem for him is that his wife can also talk to said cousin for a low-cost check. Turns out, said friend is still occasionally talking to the person he lost his virginity to when he was 18, and said girl was 15. She personally told me it was consensual, but still. The one he'd somewhat delusionally planned a future with. The one who had a pregnancy scare just after my friend's 19th birthday. She was 16. If my fiancé was as big a fan of bad ideas as I am, I'd be half tempted to add this girl to the invite list and put her at the same table as my friend and his wife. Edit. Clarified that he still talks to the girl while married.